Well, today we have a returning guest to the program, someone that we like to hear his analysis of foreign policy. He's the co host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report and the director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel McAdams, how you doing, sir?
Hi, David. Thanks for having me back on your program.
Yeah, it's great having you on. I just spoke with Colonel Douglas McGregor, and the analysis he gives is very sobering. He's concerned, and he's been proven right, as Dr. Paul and you have on what would happen. You guys have been hitting the Ukraine issue since before it was cool, before it was mainstream to talk about it. And unfortunately, all the warnings that we were meddling in Ukraine and it was going to be a blowback and Russia was going to be able to win this war and it wasn't going to be an easy fight for Russia, but it would be one that would be a decisive win for Russia. All those things seem to have been coming to fruition, and still here we are with another aid package passing the Senate. What's your take on that?
Well, it's throwing good money after bad, or throwing stolen money after bad, I guess. I
Yeah.
mean, this has been ongoing. Well, you could date it to the end of the Cold War, but certainly it's been ongoing since 2004. It wasn't 2022 when Russia moved into eastern Ukraine. It wasn't 2014 when the Maidan, the U.S.-backed overthrow of the government. It was back in '04 when Yanukovych was first elected, and the U.S. and the EU and the collective West decided that it didn't like the results of that election. So it demanded a third round be held. And by that time, of course, the color revolution, the Orange Revolution, was already in force, and that's when the first regime change happened, of course, and Western-backed regime change. Not as dramatic as Maidan, but then the Ukrainians went back to vote again, and they elected Yanukovych, the guy they originally elected, and put him in office. So that's the one they wanted in the first place. So this U.S. meddling has been going on for a long time, since the end of the Cold War. Um, um, the what's his name, Carl Gershman, the former head of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the U.S. regime change engine out there, the overt CIA kind of organization. Gershman wrote a long time ago, I think it was in the New York Times, that Ukraine is the prize. So that's been the goal of the neocons, the Russia-hating neocons from the get-go, is to bring Ukraine into our camp by hook or by crook, even if it leads us to World War III, I guess.
Why do they want Ukraine so bad?
Because they want NATO on Russia's doorstep, because the ultimate goal is regime change in Russia. That's what they've been wanting from the beginning. Russia is, for better or worse, it's basically standing up against the rapidly declining U.S. hegemony. We're leading a ragtag group of misfits. The Ukraine or the Europeans have shot themselves in the head, destroyed their economy, sunk it into recession, completely deindustrialized their country. The powerhouse of Europe, Germany, has now been overtaken by Russia as the number one economy in Europe. So they've committed suicide in the pursuit of overthrowing the Russian government, and now they're reaping, the quote unquote rewards of a bad policy. And as you mentioned, instead of just saying, you know what, this was a dumb idea, let's do something different. No, let's double down and send even more money and send even more weapons, maybe even more troops undercover in Ukrainian territory. Let's bring it right to the verge of World War III and see what happens. That's how the neocons operate, David. They never go in reverse.
I saw Tucker Carlson spoke with Glenn Beck, and I watched his first American interview since his interview with Putin, and he said that his analysis is the 60 billion to Ukraine aid doesn't even kick into some time, and that it's not in all what they would need in order to win the war. It's just a money laundering operation to make sure all the middlemen get their payoffs before this thing wraps up.
Exactly, that's it. I think it was Jake Sullivan who said even yesterday, well, 95% of the money that we send over there stays in the U.S. anyway. I mean, it's just an admission that this is welfare for the rich. The right in America loves to attack welfare for the poor, and I'm sure there's plenty of abuses of our welfare system when you're poor, but it doesn't hold a candle to welfare for the rich and the well-connected, and that's what this is all about. They want one more try. They want one more try at the apple. to get that last payoff, until the next war.
Yeah. And
China.
in that interview with Tucker Carlson, with Glenn Beck, Tucker mentioned, his take on, he said, I was kind of frustrated with Vladimir Putin going on that 30-minute historical analysis of the, starting the ancient days from modern people's perspective of the regions and the claims and the people and who did what and who converted when and all this. And he felt like at first it was like a filibuster tactic. And then he kind of said, well, I guess this is just his long train of grievances against the West. And he just wanted to make this elaborate case for this kind of historic right of Russians to have access to, this Ukrainian region, or at least some part of it. What was your perspective on that whole 30-something minute answer about why he invaded Ukraine?
It was hilarious because he started out by saying, I hope you don't mind if I take 30 seconds or a minute to go into history. Yeah. And then it was a 30-minute nonstop. The thing is, I think there are a number of reasons that Putin did it that way. The first of all, I think, was to put the discussion in perspective. And he said it more than once, is this going to be a serious discussion or a talk show? And he obviously intended it to be a serious discussion, which means you sit down and you listen to what I have to say. I think that's part of it. It sets the stage. It sets the power dynamics between the two. It's not going to be some yapping chihuahua from the U.S. mainstream media, so when did you stop beating your wife kind of questions. It was going to be a serious discussion. And that was probably the agreement. Now, the second part of it is harder for Americans to understand, which is that for most of the rest of the world, particularly Europe, history is important. History matters. The historical context matters. And I had the fortune of living in Central Europe, as you know, David, right after the end of the Cold War, and I spent nearly a decade living in Hungary. And Hungary has a long 1,000-year history as well. And as Americans, we know about the Civil War, American Revolution, civil rights movement, this and that. But when your present day is so informed by something that may have happened 500 years ago. I mean, the Hungarians would talk about the Battle of Mohacs in 1582, I think it was, as a turning point, as something that's still relevant today. The betrayals, the 1848 revolutions, there's been a long history in the Hungarian mind. I don't want to bore you with this, but of the sense of betrayal at the hands of the Russians throughout history. And so that's why they've always been skeptical, culminating in 1956. So I guess it's just a long way of saying it's hard for Americans to understand, but Europeans understand that they live in an era that is very, very heavily informed by their own history. And it's very important and relevant today.
Do you share, you've been very critical of America's foreign policy in that area and with Russia. As someone who grew up in Hungary, did you share some of those sentiments of Hungarian suspicion towards Russian power?
I didn't grow up in Hungary. I went into exile when Clinton was elected president.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And I was in grad school and I got a job in Hungary and I worked there for 10 years.
Okay, gotcha. So you came back.
Yeah. I came back just before my first child was born.
Okay.
My wife didn't want to have a baby in Hungary, so I lost that little battle.
Okay.
But yeah, you have the sense of it, and I didn't necessarily share that view at the time, but I wasn't as steeped in Hungarian history. But if you talk to a Hungarian, especially on the more patriotic, maybe conservative side, it's still very fresh.
Yeah, that kind of goes to the critique Colonel McGregor had on my program in reaction to Putin's answer to Tucker. He said, right now we're doing interviews on top of interviews on top of interviews. It's like it's an interview about an interview about an interview. Yeah. But anyways, it all works out. Colonel McGregor said, one thing that he, thinks Russia needs to reckon with is to be a little bit more open about some of the things that happened under the Soviet Union days, in particular in relationship to some of those neighbors in the region, and that Putin should do more if he wants to kind of have a new start with some of these players in the region, to be a little bit more forthcoming about, there were some real abuses and things done back then that we need to be honest about. Do you see that too?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think we saw, that's one of the things that actually struck me in the interview, is that you saw a lot of criticism on the part of Putin toward Lenin. Of course, he blames Lenin correctly for essentially the creation of Ukraine, and then continuing under Stalin and Khrushchev, the giving away of more territory of ancient Russia, as Putin sees it, at least, to Ukraine. So there was a criticism there. There's always been the idea that's been put forth in the West that he wants to recreate the Soviet Union. Of course, he never said that, but there's the idea, oh, he was in the KGB during communism. He wants to bring back communism. And I think, a closer examination, particularly when you see him pretty open about his religious practices. Of course, people who are a little more cynical might say he's just using that to manipulate the population. That could be the case. You never know what's in someone's heart. But nevertheless, the overt displays of religiosity, to me at least, seems like, as you say, trying to square that circle, trying to reconnect with a Russia that existed. A lot of the countries after communism, Dave, and this is something that was really important in Hungary, you have to, like in terms of historiography, you have to try to reconcile that communist period. That for some it was 70 years, for some it was longer. What was this era? Now, was this part of our timeline of history, or is this something that was an anomaly? Right? Is this a 70-year glitch, a 70-year anomaly? And we go back to our timeline before the communist takeover in the 40s, or the case of Russia in 1917. And so there's this kind of philosophical approach. And to me, it seems as if Putin now is trying to bridge that gap by saying there is a lot in pre-Soviet Russia that could inform a future Russia. And a lot of people are pushing for that. The Orthodox Church is growing by leaps and bounds in Russia. Conservative social values are growing. So it seems like that is the track that they're on. Although, again, I'm not a Russia expert. I'm just an observer.
Right. It seems that along those lines that Tucker is not very interested in leveling, kind of like how Dr. Paul always was. He never, on the campaign trail, really spent a lot of time criticizing the actions of other governments, but focusing on what it is that we can do here at home better. But that does open up conversations for countries outside. If we're thinking about the neighborhood, that if there were some real bad things that happened during the Soviet time, that there should be kind of a, not that we're involved in that because we're not Russian citizens, it's not our thing, but just that from a geopolitical standpoint, having a kind of reckoning with some of those things that happened during that time might be a way of kind of just getting everything more honest. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think those of us that have, for lack of better term, more of a libertarian mindset or more of a state skeptical mindset, I think how we can better inform, to use it to inform people that might listen to us, is that not necessarily the specifics of the Soviet history, but to say, look, this is what happens when governments get out of control. You've got Soviet Russia, you've got Nazi Germany, you've got fascist Italy. So this is one of the reasons that we're preaching smaller government, is because it always ends badly when government grows.
One thing I saw in the comments at some of the video platforms of my interview with Colonel McGregor was this influx. I don't know where they're coming from, but all these, it seems probably young. I don't know if you've seen this yourself, of Stalin apologists and so forth. There's like this, what is up with that? I mean, I know you're very critical of the super hawks against Russia, but have you been seeing this new trend where there's and I don't know anything about this movement really, but there's like this revisionism of like everything we know about Stalinist Russia is a total Western, hysterical lie or something, and it was actually very nice. Have you seen this, and what's your take?
Yeah, I've seen some of that, and I've seen some young people. I'm not going to name any names, but we probably know some of the same people. I've seen some of the same people. I mean, I think they're ill-informed. They're, maybe they're well-meaning. I mean, in terms, like for me personally, I mean, in terms of a counter to Trotsky, like all else being equal, as in all those dead people not being dead, Stalin was preferable because he wasn't in favor of a global Bolshevist revolution. Stalin was in favor of a revolution within the Soviet Union. Again, I'm not acting as an apologist. I'm saying in the contrast between the two.
He was containing the cancer of communism to their
Yeah.
nation rather than the whole world, right?
Yeah, but I lived. I actually, one of my earlier jobs in Hungary, I worked across the street from a very had been a very important church in Budapest that Stalin blew up. So Catholic Church in Budapest that Stalin blew up. So I certainly don't have any affection
Yeah.
for the way he treated the culture, the cultural and religious things that I find of value. So I think it's a little bit unfortunate that they view things this way.
Where did that come from? Is it it's some kind of edgelord new thing where it's not just enough to be non-interventionist for modern Russia to be, wanting to have trade and travel, but I want to revise the entire story of the Stalin arc there. It's kind of bizarre.
Yeah, it is. And it's
called MAGA communism. Is that the term they use for it?
I don't know, but history is a funny thing. It really is a funny thing. And I mean, I confess I have sympathies for the Habsburgs. I have over next to me, I have my Habsburg library, and it's partially pretty irrational. I guess if you're going to look up to a leader, it's better to be someone like like the Habsburgs than Stalin. But nevertheless, you have to be sober and view history in a sober way. You can have your favorites, but I don't think it's a good idea to have Hitler as your favorite or Stalin as your favorite. But then again, at the same time, there's a lot of propaganda and there's a lot of things said about world leaders. I mean, one of the things that as your eyes open up, that you start to realize is pretty much everything they said is fake. Everything the media tells us is fake. Everything the government tells us is fake. So.
Do you see the another thing that Tucker was making a point of that I want to get your take too is he was saying, it seemed like that Vladimir Putin was making an elaborate argument for the right of historic return, to be able to come back to those. And so that's why that kind of justifies why, in some ways, why he had a right to defend the ethnic Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine who were under attack by the government that was there because of a coup for the Western powers. That was some kind of point that he wanted to make. And Glenn Beck was quick to say, yeah, I don't share that. We can't agree with this idea that nations have this ancient historic right to return. And I'm thinking, well, that
Glenn,
yeah,
there are some exceptions.
Are you sure you don't agree with that? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Glenn, calling Glenn. Yeah, I mean, this is something that again we don't think a lot about in the U.S., but it's an incredibly important simmering issue in Europe. And I hate to bring everything back to Hungary, but after World War I, Hungary lost 60% of its territory. So if you've spent your entire life, generations back, as far as you can remember, living in a certain town and being Hungarian, and all of a sudden you become part of another country, and they say you can't speak your native language anymore, which is what happened, and not just to Hungarians, but to more recently to Russians in Eastern Ukraine. The very first thing that happened after the Maidan coup was the cancellation of Russian as an official language under Poroshenko, and so this sort of thing, it robs you of your identity. So I think this is a fundamental issue, and it's a very messy issue in Central and Eastern Europe, because you do have, for example, the Romanians have just recently voiced a claim on Bukovina, which they lost, I think, after World War II. And I think Putin mentioned that. He also mentioned the Hungarians in Transcarpathia, which was taken away after World War I. There is a risk of reopening old wounds, but it's sort of ironic because the whole purpose of our getting involved in World War I, and certainly in the aftermath of World War I, was self-determination of peoples. That people should be able to determine themselves what country they're part of, this sort of thing. So that had been denied, and it was particularly, and I remember at the end of communism, it was very, very vehemently denied by the Clinton administration and subsequent U.S. administration. That was a question that was out of the question. Don't you dare raise this. In fact, we got involved in the Balkan Wars to prevent that from happening. So that was the forcing of them to ignore the fact that once the boot of communism was off their neck, they said, hey, you know what? I'm a Croat. Don't say that. Stop saying that, you know? And so who are we to tell them?
Do you think there was a point that Putin emphasized a lot, that they were not going to be done until they completed their mission to denazify Ukraine? Again, that was a point that a lot of folks in America were like, what is he going on about? Some people on the right felt like it was a boomer type argument he was making. I don't think that was really, I think they missed the point. What was going on with that point? And it almost sounds like a war on Islamic terrorism, like an idea. Well, that's a perpetual thing. You can keep that war going in perpetuity if you're fighting an idea. What's going on with that point from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is, people in the U.S. can maybe be forgiven if they only rely on the mainstream media for their information, because the mainstream media doesn't cover what are objectively true embrace on the part of the call it the extreme right in Ukraine, to display Nazi symbols. You know, I can't tell you how many dozens of captured soldiers have, you know, a tattoo of Hitler on their chest or what have you. SS, they have the black sun. Even their own sort of national symbols now have been bringing back the symbols of the factions within Ukraine that fought alongside the SS. You know, we had the whole incident in Canada, for example, when Zelensky was there, and they actually, you know, wheeled out a guy who fought in the SS to give him a round of applause. Yeah. So this isn't something that Putin is making up. As to how he would, as to how he might operationalize this denazification, I think he kind of touched on it. Although you're right, it is difficult because it's abstract. But he was saying, you know, basically, and I think he was speaking more to European countries, that you can't just form a Nazi party and go out in the street. You know, it's forbidden. You know, for us, for me as an American, I would oppose the forbidding of that, you know, as long as no violence is involved. But they're not Americans, and they don't have the same First Amendment rights as we do. But he's saying, you know, you can't just form a Nazi party, and you shouldn't be able to do it in Ukraine either. You shouldn't be able to celebrate people who are butchers, you know, and mass murderers. So there is a lot there. There's a lot of evidence there. There's a lot of factions there. The Azov Battalion.
Yeah, he mentioned something like maybe passing a resolution or something saying that's not allowed, or something. How do you? I mean, it just seems like a very statist, abstract mission to keep going in a war. You know, that's a, you can't get people to stop thinking their thoughts by law or fiat or by, you know, conquest. It'll just go underground, as you know.
Yeah, and I think that's why the second part of that is demilitarization. So they you know, they will have to continually move westward until they feel safe. And so if there is like a little pocket of Nazis around Lvov, you know, so be it. You're not going to be able to look to send missiles to Moscow. You know, maybe that's the goal, or you'll be so destroyed, your economy will be so destroyed that you'll have to worry about other things. But you know, it's understandable for a country that lost so many millions of people under Hitler's invasion to recoil at the idea. And the thing is, it is real. And I mentioned it on another interview I did recently. I happened to be in Latvia in, I think it was 2006 in March. I was doing an election there in Belarus. And I had been warned by my colleagues. I was working with the British Helsinki group at the time, or I had been. And they said, well, there's going to be their yearly celebration of the SS. They're going to march to Riga. And I said, come on, you guys are joking. People don't do that anymore. Yeah. You know, and here I'm woken up in my hotel room. I look out the window and here they are walking down the street in their SS uniforms. So this stuff is real. They still do celebrate this. And I think the average person would think it's not a very healthy way to think.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see, you know, if that is something that actually continues to be a mission objective, or just something that he's using rhetorically to joust with the West and because the Western religion is the anti-fascist religion, right? The Antifa is like that is basically the doctrinal kind of impetus of the West's existence, is that we in the West are a coalition after World War II that is united on one thing, and that is to be anti-fascist. And I think Putin is rhetorically trying to. It seems like, this is the great grandchildren of the World War II era fighting over who gets to have the mantle of, the winners of that conflict in this world order that we're in. It seems like they're fighting over who gets to hold that mantle.
Yeah, but I do think in Ukraine we're talking about a relatively small faction
Yeah.
of people. I mean, this is not the state. Now we know that leaders use symbols to manipulate people, and we have it
Yeah.
here in the U.S. That's what leaders do. They brainwash people. But I think when you actually boil it down, it's not a national ideology. This kind of neo-fascism in Ukraine, it's not a national ideology. It's just a small faction of people.
Yeah. Turning to another topic briefly here, that's kind of connected here with this border crisis. Tucker Carlson has suggested that the evidence of these very nice buses down there at the Darien Pass or whatever, and they've got these nice buses. People are being loaded up on there. There's a lot of reports. Brett Weinstein was over there, and different folks going over there and saying there's something really coordinated here from United Nations, taking buses and very well funded, very well organized machine to pump tons and tons of primarily young men to America. And then you hear about things like New York City, where they're going to be handing out debit cards with thousands of dollars, just cash flowing into these people. Here, go have fun. It's your city now. Take over. Start spreading the news.
Yeah.
We're leaving today, New York, New York. So what do you see? Tucker made a point. I know I'm kind of riffing off him, but there's just so much there. He's the most important journalist right now, so he's really moving the narrative.
Sure, absolutely.
But he made a point I never thought about. He said, they're bringing all these young military age men, and who do you think is going to need to be the military if it starts being sicked on American people domestically?
Yeah.
You're going to have to get rid of the people who have been in the military traditionally, regardless of who they are and their religion or ethnicity, but they've been here a long time generationally in America. They have a fidelity to the neighborhoods. If you need to start bringing a crackdown on the military domestically, it would be convenient to have lots of people who just showed up and they're ready for the new remaking of America, and they need to do the dirty job that fellow Americans would have a harder time doing. Do you see that as? I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, Doug McGregor has tweeted a few times about that as well, and it's a good point. And by and large, I just saw a tweet earlier today. Something like 7% of American males of war fighting age or military age are too fat and too full of mental illness to actually qualify to join the military.
Yeah.
I don't know how true that is, but you're having guys over there who have lived in conditions where they've had to fight and be pretty brutal. So if that is the case, if you want to impose a tyranny on the American people, I can't imagine a better way of doing it than getting these people that have real combat experience, even if they're not in official militaries, gangs or whatever, to come over here and do the bidding of the people in DC who want to keep power above all. And I'll tell you, David, if I heard this a few years ago, I would have thought it was a pretty kooky conspiracy theory.
It's crazy.
Yeah. But nothing sounds as kooky anymore to me.
Is there any? And I'm just totally asking. If you don't know, it's fine. But is there any evidence that these mass wave of undocumented illegals are getting drafted into the military or joining the military? I haven't seen that.
I don't know, but I think one of the things that McGregor said is that basically, if they're going to be promised citizenship if they join, that sort of thing, and hey, and that would be a way that they could use this. They could say, hey, look, we don't want to deport you, but we're going to have to. But here's a way out. You can join the military, and who knows? I mean, you'd say, well, that's kind of a crazy thing, but especially this administration has been doing a lot of crazy things over the past 3 years. So I wouldn't put it past them.
It seems like this is a real vicious, hostile move that's being done here, to say the least. I mean, you're flooding millions of people in every year. You're giving them debit cards with cash. They don't know where they're coming from. No one's asking questions. Meanwhile, we're picking a fight in the Middle East every other day, and all those folks are now coming over here with grudges against. Yeah. And you're thinking, are you trying to create hell on earth or what? I mean, you couldn't ask for a worse recipe for destruction here.
And add to it the fact that we've absolutely flooded the world with weapons.
Yeah.
with zero accountability. Remember back when the Ukraine started and we were going to send them a couple javelins, and Senator Paul said, hey, but can we at least, before we send them, can we at least assign someone to keep track of them? Oh, you're Putin's puppet, shut up, get out of here, take a hike. Well, we have no idea what's happened to these weapons. And Dr. Paul and I did a show like a year ago or something about this, where, some of these shoulder fired rockets were found near the border with Mexico on the other
Yeah.
side. So these guys are going to get these things. They're they may be criminal, but in some ways they're better capitalists than we are.
Yeah.
They know the worldwide market in weapons.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite, and I think all these things, foreign policy, running afoul of basic civility and basic logic, basic restraint, combined with this insane, uh, it looks like United Nations related globalist migration plan. It looks like we're undergoing quite a bunch of quick changes to the terms of the agreement that we were supposed to be under in America for some time now. And I don't think it feels like the calm before the storm, because you go out in everyday life, and if you happen to be living in a place that's relatively normal and away from all the turmoil of these densely populated cities, things seem to be kind of running along despite inflation, despite extreme prices at the pump. Things are just kind of quiet. Birds are chirping. Things are going on, but it feels like the calm before the storm here.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it seems like a recipe for a civil war
Yeah.
coming up ahead. And as you say, you're right. I mean, most of us are insulated from it. We're not on the front lines. Inflation hurts,
Yeah.
but you can always kind of buckle up a little bit more until it busts open. And you got to wonder. I mean, I was actually we've been talking about Colonel McGregor as well. I had lunch with him a couple of years ago. I think it was now. It doesn't seem that long ago, but he was saying, there's no alternative on the Republican side either. I mean, he said, we don't have anybody. There's just no one out there
Yeah.
who's, we're in an existential crisis. We don't know what the future of America should be. No one has a vision of it. And even President Trump, there are many things that I like about Trump. A big one being his name is not Joe Biden, right? But he doesn't, to me, seem to have an intellectual vision for the future of America.
Yeah.
And I think that's the real crisis that we're in.
The closest to an intellectual leader in the American conservative movement, I think, right now is Tucker Carlson, and the way he's able to move the narratives here. I mean, his interviews set the tone for a lot of the conversation in the country, which is very few conservatives or non-leftists have that ability to set the tone of the 24-hour news cycle, or even a week, as some of his interviews have been doing. So we can only hope that more. I did a recent story on Glenn Jacobs, who I know is a friend of you and Dr. Paul's. And,
great guy.
I don't know what his future plans are. I asked him if he's going to go back to the ring or some point, or is he going to do something more in politics after his mayor's term expires. But I'd like to see him up there doing some choke slamming during the next Rand Paul filibuster. If you ask me, I tell you what, it'd be nice to see Glenn Jacobs stare down Mitt Romney or Lindsey Graham next time they want to talk smack about being Putin's puppet to Rand Paul or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I forget who I was talking to recently, but someone mentioned that he might be interested, or that they're interested in him. Maybe running for governor of Tennessee, which I think he'd be great at that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he's, from everything that I've seen, he's done a great job in Knoxville, in a pretty important position. I think a lot of people, when he was elected to that position, thought it was just going to be a trophy for him, but that's not at all the case. Yeah. I mean, he has put every bit of effort into it. So I think he can pretty much do what he wants. He's done a great job.
Yeah. Another guy that I know is a big fan of Ron Paul. I wish he would do more. And this is just me talking, is Vince Vaughn. I wish I'd hear more from him, because he's quick with his words. He's funny. He's got that winsome personality. And I know he's probably got his own commitments, but I wish we could see more from him about speaking out on some of these issues like war and the Fed, because he's very effective when he does,
Yeah, he's a great guy. So one of the problems is David, that during a presidential campaign, particularly the one that when one gets some traction, it's easy. People come in and glom on. It's a kind of a quick fix because it's very finite.
Yeah.
And so people get very excited. When we started the Ron Paul Institute 10 years ago, and we're in for the long haul. We're an educational organization. We're trying to make the case for liberty. And I'll be the first to admit it's not as exciting as a presidential campaign.
Right.
And that can be very frustrating. And I think I met Vince Vaughn at Dr. Paul's house, but I don't know him certainly very well. But I think a lot of people that are involved in the entertainment business, they like the excitement, the glamour. And I can assure you that, and as well from all the shows you do, there's not much glamorous about trying to sift through this stuff and digest it and present it to people.
It's a bit of a slog. It can be, yes.
Yes, it is.
Speaking of the presidential campaigns, Trump basically confirmed that a few names that he has on a VP list, Vivek and Tulsi Gabbard, were names that he dropped that he might have as a VP. Do you like either of those as an option?
We've had Vivek on the show a couple times. We've had a lot of conversations with him. I think there's a lot to like about him. There are some things I don't like about him. I think some of that can be chalked up to his relative lack of experience. He's never been elected to anything, but I think he has good instincts. I think he's very, very courageous. The problem is, what does he bring? This is a calculation. I think there's a tendency to make it like a Hollywood romance, but it's not. There's a calculation. For example, Trump wouldn't want someone from Florida because he's not going to really bring anything. He needs to have someone who can bring home the bacon from a state that Trump needs. And that's not an overriding factor, but it certainly is a factor. So I think, Vivek not having he has a physical home, but not a political home necessarily in Ohio. It makes me wonder about that. I think that Tulsi is less of a factor than she was a while ago. So, I don't see her as being someone he'd choose. I've been wrong. I could be wrong about this though.
Yeah. I think Vivek said he ran afoul of a lot of the big Republican donors when he made some of his stances in the primary, later in the primary. So if Trump's in need of some money with all the financial issues he's got going on, Vivek probably would be a little bit of a damper on some of that big money donors coming in for him in the general election. I can see that from just looking pragmatically at the utility of politics there. So
could be the case. Yeah.
Well, Daniel, I really appreciate your time. We've covered a lot of issues. Tell us a little bit about anything going on in your world with your organization and the things that you guys are doing with Dr. Paul, any upcoming events or things that people would like to know about.
Well, we have a conference down here in Brazoria County coming up on April 13th. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're doing it together with our friends at the Mises Institute. So it's good to be joining up with them again. And we'll definitely have our yearly DC conference, probably late August, early September. That's always a huge blast. And talking about McGregor, he's been speaking at 3 or 4 of them in the past. So we always have terrific speakers, people that are really on the leading edge of intellectual thought in America. And we also always have a good time, which is the rule. You got to have fun. So we're having a lot of events this year. We do the show every day, Monday through Friday, Monday through Thursdays with me. Fridays focuses on economics with Chris Rossini as a co-host. And we have a curated web page where we publish articles every day at ronpaulinstitute.org.
Well, very good. Thank you, sir, for your time, Daniel. It was always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, David.
Very good.